Hi, welcome to MBX 9152 Week 6 Introduction. My name is David Goad and I am your course coordinator for MBX 9152 Digital Strategy. The topic for this week is Strategic Digital Technology Decisions. And so I'll be going through a brief introduction around this topic in this video. My agenda for this video will be as follows. It will be similar to previous weeks where I will talk about this week's content and some of the key concepts. I'll also be adding some of my views, personal views with regards to strategic decision making. And then I'll talk about the to-dos for this upcoming week 6. And then just a reminder with regards to completing the mid-semester survey. I'm going to send you guys out a announcement around that to remind you, but if people could complete the mid-semester survey, that would be great as well. So most of the content this week and topic this week is around strategic digital decisions making processes, specifically around digital technologies. But there's also a lot of content specifically around just how people make decisions in general, which is quite interesting in terms of trying to understand how people think. So we'll start off by talking about what is the content that was covered off in the textbook readings this week. So you guys were supposed to read chapter 3 around how to establish an effective decision-making process with regards to digital technologies. And really the textbook talked around sort of 3 core concepts. It first talked around the stages of an organization's maturity with regards to digital technologies. And what the textbook there talked about was that there was 5 core stages, which they referred to as technology-led, method-driven, administrative, business-led, and organizational-led. And so in the first sort of stage 1 with regards to developing a digital technology strategy and doing digital decisions, they talked about organizations being technology-led, where there's a lot of bottom-up development. IT is really driving the strategy with regards to digital technologies, and that there's, basically it's all around the IS and IT applications. Then you talk about method-driven or stage 2, where they do start talking about what the actual business needs are. It's not being driven by IT anymore. It is more a senior management process, and there is some agreement that's going on between the business and IT with regards to priorities. Then you talk about stage 3 that organizations go through, where they have a active portfolio of different IS/IT projects. There's a planning process that goes on that is managed between the business and IT. And it's very much an administrative process where there's a whole bunch of long laundry list of ideas and people sort of jockey for positioning the various ideas and negotiate around that. Then they talk about stage 4, which is a more mature business where they refer to as business-led strategic decision making with regards to IT and IS. And here there's a lot more executive engagement. There is a opportunity-based view in terms of how you develop your digital strategy, and you're looking to try and achieve strategic and competitive advantages. And finally, the last stage that organizations go through is what they refer to as organization-led, where there was a strong linkage between business and IT strategy. And this is one of the things we've talked about repeatedly in this course, the idea that you want your IT/IS strategy to be closely linked with your business strategy, and you want them to work back and forth and be supporting each other. Another key topic that it talked about in this week's text readings on chapter 3 was this idea that there are several sort of enablers, inhibitors with regards to strategic alignment. So some of the enablers were things like senior executive support and driving, IT staff that are involved at a very high level in terms of strategic strategy development, CIOs who report into the CEO and have a voice in terms of the executive committee, that the IT staff understands the business. So these are just not technologists, but actually people have a really good grounding in terms of the business, so they can relate the business requirements to the technology requirements. And that there's a strong partnership between the business and IT, and that the projects are well prioritized based on genuine business value. Then you have a lot of inhibitors which could inhibit or prevent alignment between IS, IT, and the business. And these include things just like, there's just no relationship between the business and IT. They just operate as separate organizations. They don't prioritize well from an IT perspective. IT is not known for meeting its commitments. It tends to fail a lot of commitments, and it doesn't really understand the business. And there's no sort of senior management support for IT initiatives, and no interest in them, and they don't see them as being critical to business success. And then the textbook goes on to propose sort of a basic framework for IS IT strategy formulation. Excuse me. And it really talks about this idea that you have a series of business and technical environments. You're going to have sort of an initial strategy. You're going to take a look at your current business situation, try to identify your various needs and wants. Then you're going to come up with a sort of an information system strategy, recognizing, like we talked about in previous weeks, that information systems is about the whole process, including the people, process, and the technology. Information technology strategy is clearly just about the technology, so you're going to develop that. Then you're going to relate that back to the business strategy process, and there's going to be a close management between those two, where you're developing your business strategy that's impacting your IT strategy, your IT and IS strategy, and then it influences your business strategy. And then out of that, you're going to have some sort of firm plans and processes. Pretty much straightforward, pretty generic. What the textbook maintains it says several times throughout the course of its writings in chapter 3 is that there is no one clear process for any organization. Organizations have to come up with a process or framework that's useful for them. The next reading that you guys have to go through, it talks about this idea of how do organizations make decisions, and this is more from a generic perspective. I don't see this as being very technical, and it just talks about, and this is what I was saying in this week's readings, we can talk from a digital technology decision perspective, but there's also just a lot of sort of basic business readings and writings with regards to how do businesses and people make decisions, which are applicable to digital technology strategy decisions as well. So, and then this particular reading, they talk about this, and it's one of the older readings, but still quite relevant. It talks about that there's different views in terms of how organizations make decisions. The first one is that decisions are sequential. In other words, it's a straightforward set of decisions. One influences the next one, and so on and so forth. The next view is that there's basically anarchy, and that there's really no kind of structure in terms of how decisions are being made. Another view says that it's iterative, where people make decisions, and those decisions influence next decisions, and there's really an iteration process that goes back and forth trying different things. There's another view that talks about this idea of convergence, that what happens is there'll be a series of decisions made over the course of time, and eventually over the course of time people will convalesce or converge in terms of a view or a central view in terms of what the strategy should be for the organization, both digitally and business-wise. Then there's another view that says that really good decision making is insightful. In other words, it relies on the knowledge and background and history of the people in the senior management making the decisions. And then the next view that you get with regards to decision making is what they refer to as interwoven, where they say that all these decisions are all happening simultaneously and they're all influencing each other simultaneously. The reading goes on to talk about how people should view decision making, and really the objective, and this is more of a theoretical paper. It talks about the idea of how you should be considering decision making processes when doing research and when thinking about them. And it says that to begin with, a lot of in terms of research, but also in terms of organizations, when people look back at decisions, they tend to look at the implication of the decision. In other words, they deploy this new technology, or when did the actual decision be made? So they kind of work backwards to take a look at the decision from the outputs. And what they're saying is you should start back at what actually caused people to think about that decision, and let that influence your evaluation of the process. They suggest trying new perspectives, looking at from different levels of the organization is always helpful. I think it's important to follow the processes in real time when you're evaluating decision-making processes, as well as looking at them retrospectively. That people and personality are important, not just events, and that's absolutely true. Personalities have a heavy impact in terms of decision-making process in organizations. And they think it's useful to reanalyze previously analyzed decision processes, not just look at new ones, to learn from history. The next reading that we talk about is actually written by one of our local authors, Thomas Tam. He's actually in a lecture at the IS school at UNSW, and he basically, through going through a whole series of literature and papers, came up with what he thought was and him and his co-writers came up with what they thought is a sort of a framework for strategic decision-making processes, specifically related to IT decisions. And the way like I said, he did that is by looking at a whole bunch of different papers and looking at the processes in those papers that they described. And in terms of this process that he talked about, he said that there was three sort of core factors that influenced the decisions, strategic decisions. These included the actual decision context, external environment, organizational characteristics. The top management team had a significant influence on that. Team level characteristics and the characteristics of the actual senior leadership. And then he said there was actually characteristics specific to the actual type of decision in terms of whether it matters or not, and sort of informal factors. These all influence two things. These influence the nature of the process, so whether people used an analytical versus an intuitive versus what was, by default a political process. And then they also influence the actual strategic decisions that were being made, which then had organizational outcomes and factors that affected further decisions down the road. And based on this model, they made a series of propositions. These propositions were that, firstly, both the external environment and organizational characteristics have an influence in terms of the strategic decision-making process, and in terms of whether it's analytical versus intuitive or political. That changes in the external environment and organizational characteristics may result in top management team making different strategic decisions. That both team level and individual decision makers on the top management team influence the nature of the strategic decision processes. So there's influence from the people in terms of how the process works. That the top level team and individual decision maker characteristics of the top management team may result in making different decision making. So if the team changes, there'll be different decisions. Both decision make matter and informational characteristics of the specific decision under consideration influence the type of decision-making process, and that changes in the decision matter and informal characteristics may influence the actual decisions themselves, and then the extent to which a strategic IT decision-making process is organizational or analytical versus intuitive versus political emerges through these processes from different degrees in different decision context. So even in the same organization, the degree to which they're analytical versus intuitive versus political may depend on the actual decision. So this was just a framework to just kind of describe how decisions are made in terms of organizations. The next, it wasn't a reading, it was the video that you guys are supposed to go to. It was actually one of the probably more interesting videos I found of the course so far this year. And it really just talks about how, whether human beings are good decision makers, period. And there's a lot of sort of interesting things that come out of the video, and also things that I can tell you in terms of my experiences with regards to decision making in the literature that are important for people to understand. The first one is that when people make decisions, they tend to have a lot of cognitive biases. So for example, you saw in the video and you saw in this diagram onto the right, the question was which table is longer. It turns out they're both the same length, but even when I tell you that, and even when you understand that that's the case, you still perceive the one to the left as being longer. And this is what they refer to as a cognitive heuristic or cognitive bias. The idea here is that we have a series of shortcuts that we use. Some of these biases include things like confirmation bias, anchoring, loss aversion. So we have little sort of shortcuts that we use as human beings to make decisions. And the problem is sometimes these cognitive heuristics or shortcuts don't lead us to the right decisions. And the other problem with this is even if we know that we are subject to these cognitive heuristics or biases, we still can't get around them. So even though I tell you that those two tables are the same length, you still see the table to the left as being longer. And so that's one of the problems with human decision making, is that because we do take these shortcuts, because we make presumptions, sometimes we can make the wrong decisions even when we know we're making the wrong decisions. The other thing that's important to understand is that we as human beings are very lazy in terms of making decisions. There's a lot of literature that shows that if a human being is given a choice between either making a better decision or making a quicker decision, we'll typically take the path of making a quicker decision, which is not necessarily always ideal. So we always tend to take quick decisions. We don't tend to spend more time to actually come up with a better decision. And then the last point I wanted to make here is there was a very well-known writing in the literature called where it was actually Nobel Prize winning, where a paper on this concept of prospect theory. And what this talked about was the fact that classical economics used to say that as human beings, as decision makers, used to take all the different options, we weigh up all the different options, we look at the costs and the benefits, and we pick the best one. The reality of it is that's not the case. We as human beings look at the prospect, our outlooks going forward, and we make decisions based on that. And what's even more interesting is that we make decisions, we are more concerned about losses than we are about gains. What this means is that if I put a question to you in terms of a potential loss and position something in terms position a question to you or a decision to you in terms of losses, you will likely make a different decision than if I present a decision to you in terms of gains. So really what this talks about is that people are very subject to how the question is being asked in terms of making a decision. And this is also a problem. The other thing to recognize is that we as humans are not really good at managing a lot of different bits of information. The reality of it is the more information you give us, the more volume, the more velocity, the more variety of data that we get, the worse we get at being decision makers. I'm an instructor for the Royal Fire Service, and in the Royal Fire Service, we talk about the rule of five. We say that a human being can't manage more than 5 things at any one time. As a consequence, they typically have five firefighters to 1 deputy captain, 5 deputy captains to 1 group captain, and so on and so forth. Contrary to that, machines, artificial intelligence, tend to get better as you give them more volume, velocity, and variety of data to manage. The challenge with this is when you get in the middle where you got a lot of volume of variety and velocity of data, which makes it harder for human beings to make decisions, but it's not enough data for the machines to make an effective decision or to build an effective AI model. But these are limitations that we need to recognize about us as. The next reading talked about coming up with essentially a decision quality checklist, and they came up with a series of questions that you could ask yourself as a manager to make sure that you are making the right decisions. These questions included things like, is there a reason to suspect that there's motivated errors or errors are driven by self-interest? So are people looking after themselves and not necessarily the organization? Have people just become enamored with a particular idea because it was their idea or for other reasons that are not, beneficial to the organization? When there are just dissenting opinions within the recommending team, was everyone's voice heard and equally weighted, or were certain individuals overwhelming the group in terms of the decision process? Could the diagnosis of the situation be overly influenced by analogies? In other words, previous history is affecting go forward and is not really relevant. Have you looked at all the possible alternatives and taken those into consideration before making a decision? If you had to make this decision a year from now and had better information, would you make the same decision? Are you asking, are you making the decision because you don't have good information right now, and is that a problem that you should be fixing? Do you know where the numbers came from in terms of the decision making, the business case? Do you believe in that information? Is there a halo effect? So and what they mean by halo effect is that people are attracted to a decision emotionally because it's an idea that's been offered by one particular person, or it's just something that the organization likes, but it may not necessarily have an effective business case. And are people, looking at spent costs and worrying about previous decisions and trying to justify those previous decisions and their future decisions, or are they looking forward and looking at what's the best for the organization? And oftentimes decisions can be overly optimistic. There's what they refer to as optimism bias. This is another cognitive heuristic, as I was talking about in the previous slide, where people tend to be more optimistic about the benefits of a potential solution than the negatives about it. And have you really done your due diligence around what are the worst case scenarios in terms of making a decision that you're making? And what I always say is that if you're going to make a decision, you need to be prepared for all outcomes. So if you're going to decide that you're going to do something, invest in a new technology, make an organizational change, be prepared of if those things that you don't want to happen do happen. Are you willing to accept all the negatives as well as the positives? This is just something additional to me that I thought I'd throw in there. And I call it the firefighter's view of decision making. So as I said to you, I'm an instructor for the Royal Fire Service. I'm a qualified crew leader, so I'm do teaching around. I teach firefighters in terms of how to do village firefighting, how to do first aid, how to do basic firefighting. I teach a whole bunch of different courses. And one of the things we talk about in the fire service or the Royal Fire Service is this idea of decision making. And what we say is that there's 2 different types of decision making. So we talk about intuitive decision making, we talk about logical decision making. Intuitive decision making is where people have mental maps. They've done something similar before, so they know that in this particular situation, if they do something similar again and have a similar solution to that situation, then it'll probably work. So for example, if I'm a deputy captain and I've been on a fire crew and I've gone out to previous motor vehicle accidents, and I know that I should organize my team in a certain way and put out my firehouse in a certain way and worry about certain issues, then I'm pretty sure if I come on to another motor vehicle accident that's similar, that I needed to be doing similar things. Then they talk about this idea of logical decision making, where people, as I was talking about in some of the previous slides, try to weigh up all the different aspects of a decision, look at all the different alternatives, and apply some sort of a logic to that. So that's what we refer to as logical decision making. Although, as I said in previous slides, sometimes it's not that logical. Example, prospect theory. What they found is that the more experienced firefighter typically relies more on intuitive decision making. So instead of weighing up all the available options when coming to a scenario, whether it's a house fire, car fire, or someone injured or whatever, they do what's called satisfying. In other words, they come up with a solution that they know that's worked before. It might not be the perfect solution, but it's a pretty okay solution. But it does have the advantage that you can do it quickly because you know what to do. So they find that more experienced firefighters, because they have these sort of mental maps, tend to use more intuitive decision making. It's the more junior leaders in the fire service who tend to use more logical decision making, where they'll sit down, they'll pause in the middle of the actual incident, and they'll try to evaluate all the options before they take a decision. The disadvantage of a logical decision making process is the fact that it takes longer to do. And then, in an emergency situation, you don't want to have that time. What that reflects the fact that it is a more junior officer in the fire service probably will take longer to do things and get things done and have a lower success rate than a more senior officer who's got more experience, more mental maps, has done things more often than a more junior officer. You apply this to business. The idea here is that most business managers are what I refer to as pattern matchers. In other words, they look at the decisions they make on a day-to-day basis. They look at previous scenarios that were similar to the scenario that they have to make a decision about today, and they apply that same decision because they know it worked previously. So very much like a firefighter, a lot of business managers, because they're managing a lot of different issues at the same time, will use this intuitive decision-making process and essentially use satisfying. They'll basically find a solution that's satisfactory, but probably not the most ideal solution. It's only when they come up with a completely novel scenario or situation that they'll sit down and actually try to apply some logical decision-making process to that. Anyways, so that's kind of a review for the content for last week. Your to-dos for this week are as follows. Number one, you need to complete the core readings. So we've already talked about that. And we talked about that content in the previous slides. Number two, you need to do your discussion topic. And what you're going to do here is talk about, what is a good strategic decision? How can an organization tell whether it's good or not? So that's going to be your discussion topic with the other people. What we'd like you to do for your blog post is actually reflect on a strategic digital technology decision. This can be a decision that you were involved with, or this can be a decision that you've seen your organization or a well-known organization make a decision. Maybe it was in the news or something like that. The idea here is for you to reflect on that, to look at that digital technology decision process, and to learn or pick the stuff that you've gotten from the readings and apply it to that process. So I don't want you just sort of to feedback the process and describe the decision that was made. I want you to actually apply what you got from the readings to that and be reflective in terms of what you learned from the readings and apply that to that decision-making process. In terms of your group projects, you should all be in your groups. You should all have talked about your topic. I have already received a number of emails from people. Thank you in terms of your topic, so we'll get back to you in terms of approving those topics, so you need to be moving ahead on that. And also just a gentle reminder that the mid-semester survey is out there now. I'm going to send you guys an announcement to remind you about that, but I really, really would appreciate if you guys could fill in the mid-semester survey or the midterm survey so that I can get some feedback from you in terms of how the course is going and what do I need to provide you guys with a better experience in terms of your learning. And also next week after the mid-semester or midterm survey closes, and we're about halfway point, I'm going to provide you guys with some feedback through Moodle in terms of how you're doing with your discussion. So I'll give you sort of some midterm grades and kind of give you a benchmark in terms of how well you're doing from your discussion feedback points. I've already gone through and reviewed a number of your discussion posts and given you written feedback, but I'll actually give you a mark feedback next week in terms of where you're lining up in terms of your grade thus far, which should hopefully give you an opportunity to improve over the second half of the term. Anyways, if there's any questions, please post them on the Q&A forum or send me an email, and I hope you guys have a great week. Thanks.